Good greetings. The topic for this video's discussion is peak. The topic for this video's discussion is Just Rights, Attack on Titan, and the dangers of Allegory. The focus of our examination will be on the central argument proposed and the key points that buttress it. Carefully, we will analyze the validity of its claims whilst taking into account the response garnered. Two videos I have selected to represent this, Just the Critics and Literal Mavericks, so it must be remembered this is not exhaustive of the reactions and counter-arguments that have been leveled against it.
But my personal feelings about where it succeeds or fails as a piece of entertainment are entirely beside the point today. Though I've enjoyed a lot of the show as pure action, this video is about unpacking the ideas that the story intentionally or unintentionally communicates. And during its 13-year run, Attack on Titan has attracted wide-ranging criticism from promoting imperialism, fascism, and anti-semitism. I'm going to be taking a look at these one by one, and after doing that, my conclusion is that even though the stated themes of the show are often explicitly against those ideas, I do not think that creator Hajime Isayama has done enough to close the door on these kinds of interpretations.
To this diagrammatic representation of his argument, we will continually refer, and by the end, it will help us ascertain just how valid his argument holds.
In a 2010 blog post by Isayama, he admitted that he modeled the character of Dot Pixis after General Yoshifuru Akiyama, adding that Akiyama was a man I respect for leading such a simple and frugal life. In the show, Dot Pixis is portrayed as wise, eccentric, and moral. He basically has no flaws at all, and is the only member of the garrison regiment who is depicted entirely positively. General Akiyama, on the other hand, is a deeply hated figure in Korea for his involvement in the First Sino-Japanese War and the colonization of Korea, which Japan occupied from 1910 to 1945. Akiyama was the commander of the cavalry division in that war, and later the commander of the army stationed in Korea. The revelation that Pixis was based on Akiyama led to an internet flame war and countless death threats sent to Isayama. And it's not the only imperialistic reference in the show. Mikasa is named after an Imperial Japanese Navy dreadnought from the Russo-Japanese War. And Erwin Smith, who shares a first name with Nazi General Erwin Rommel, has a story which bears some resemblance to Rommel's life. Now, whether these references amount to anything substantial in the broader sense of the story, though, is difficult to pin down. And the problem we have with the series is we can ask questions like, does Attack on Titan endorse imperialism? But we're going to run into trouble when we try to figure out what's more important, the themes that are explicitly stated in the text, or the implications that exist as subtext. Attack on Titan is a war story for the most part, and it often depicts war as horrific. One of the first scenes depicts the Survey Corps coming back after a disastrous mission, and one member of the unit breaking down and saying that their comrades died for nothing. That sense of futility in the face of the Titan threat is ever present.
References to the Imperial Japanese war machine of the colonization of Korea, the Russo-Japanese War, and to the Desert Fox of the Second World War are here being raised to the suggestion that they may indicate the mangaka Hajime Isayama's own political leanings, and doom an interpretation based on artistic intent to the issues inherent to that. This is a plausible argument, but lacks in that it is hinged on assumptions. If it is to hold, concrete evidence would have to be provided, showing these references to be more than just references. Just Right raises the point that to avoid certain interpretation, focus must be directed to the stated themes. This makes sense, and the challenge he proposes follows from that is inefficient presentation. Mentioned are the themes of war and futility. This is then juxtaposed to the intense action, a core appeal as he mentioned it. It is not a denouncing of the violence, rather a support to the idea that deferring to the stated themes, fleeing from the potential imperialism, will lead to muddy interpretation. I agree with the assessment that there is a discrepancy between the context's bemoaning of the subject, yet occasional seeming glorification of the action. A very good point, only that to explain why in Attack on Titan specifically it is detrimental was necessary. The presence of glorified action does not immediately mean the message the show is bringing forth is corrupted. The lack of such an explanation left the point vulnerable.
Is actually not a glorification of violence or war, but instead these elements are used as a reintroduction of the character of Mikasa. This takes place in Season 4, Episode 6, and we had yet to see Mikasa at all this season. This is due to the season starting off from the perspective of Eldians and Marley, such as Reiner, Gabby, and Falco. So this particular scene shows a reintroduction to a character after 6 episodes of a season and after a 4-year time skip. So that's why the music and shots are hyped. They're not hyped for the violence taking place. And you can also tell this from just a few shots after the one that he decided to use, this scene takes place.
エレン、あなたは自分が何をやったか分かってるの？あなたは民間人を殺した。
Depict with his analysis. Some can say the show is just merely representing the skill and precision of said characters. It's not saying their violence is morally right, not at all. In fact, to use the clip he used of Mikasa heroically dispatching the enemy with violence, she then moments later on looks Eren in the eyes, questioning his humanity as he just killed children. For every action that romanticizes violence, there is always one that undermines it. Attack on Titan is one of the few shows where I almost got sick to the stomach because of the darkness and
Although the common inference, just right, again did not condemn the scene as a glorification of violence, but used it to suggest inadequate presentation. The idea is, it is difficult to focus on the plain themes as there is a contradiction, not that the violence being glorified detracts from the show. Though I'm in agreement with the point that the action is brilliantly glorified, literal Maverick's point is much stronger, being better supported.
Reintroduction to a character after 6 episodes of a season and after a 4-year time skip. So that's why the music and shots are hyped. They're not hyped for the violence taking place. And you can also tell this from just a few shots after the one that he decided to use, this scene takes place.
エレン、あなたは自分が何をやったか分かってるの？あなたは民間人を殺した。もう取り返しがつかない。
This scene, and the scene of Eren causing this horror, is very clearly depicted as horrible and dreadful. I mean, if we had the hype music over these scenes... yeah, that would be a problem.
Regardless of whether or not the cool element is a subjective matter, the fact remains the action is portrayed in an exhilarating and thrilling manner. The marketing itself is testimony to this. However, just right falters in leaving the implication that on its own, this fact detracts from the show. I would suggest that the point would be more complete if we conclude that the considerations of the effects of the war and the chaos brought about are not strongly explored or are merely sandwiched in between the glorified action. This is a potential interpretation in a more defensible position, but it is not my own as I watch the show. Just a critic's words ring more poignant here.
Attack on Titan is one of the few shows where I almost got sick to the stomach because of the darkness and complications the series brings when dealing with violence and war. Yes, sure, violence is used a lot, but it's never said or presented as the right option, rather the contrary. You have Armin himself, a character the audience can identify as the smartest person, constantly talking about how we should avoid conflict and the ramifications of their actions. Even the music in the later season when Armin commits such a horrific act is painfully sad. Actually, a really clear moment is back in season 3 when Jean is about to get shot by a member of Kenny's squad.
Not to glorify violence or war, but to show the struggles and prowess of particular characters. Just Right himself stated that the show very clearly shows the futility against the Titan threat. So then the cool shots of people in uniform are used as a way of indicating that they're able to tackle something that is incredibly difficult to fight against. You can have an anti-war story that shows violence in a way in which the audience does cheer on the protagonists. Or are we saying that if violence is ever depicted in a quote-unquote cool way, that the art can never have anti-war messaging? Again, the Titans are clearly depicted as an unstoppable threat for the first 3 seasons of the show. The protagonist being able to combat this threat is depicted with awe because it is impressive, based on the force that we've seen from the Titans in prior seasons. And it shows off the protagonists in our story and their progression.
Though they lean into their claim that Just Right is condemning the violence or incredible action, which he is not, these are valid arguments and stronger ideas. Therefore, the point falters and the imperialism issue is left dangling. The next point to save or doom the imperialist claim is Shinzo Abe's reversing of Article 9.
And other nationalists in Japan, Article 9 is humiliating, an unfair restriction placed on them by the United States. So at the time when Attack on Titan was reaching the height of its popularity with the release of the anime, the country it was being published in and catered towards was militarizing. It's not that much of a stretch to say that the series functioned as Japanese military propaganda. That's something I've been critical of in other pieces of media, and I feel the same way about it here.
Here we are told what could be true. It is possible Isayama drew on these events for inspiration, and that his work was influenced in support of that. It isn't much of a stretch to say that. Say that we cannot, however, for again, the evidence besides assumption here lacks.
This point is a very obscure one. He states it's not much of a stretch to depict Attack on Titan as functioning as military propaganda, partly because real-world events happen to coincide with its popularity. The amount of assumptions made within this argument are staggering. Was the author influenced by current military events to change his story? Were people made more positive towards the military as a result? How many people in Japan even agreed? And how many of those were drawn to Japan even agreed? It's akin to the anti-video game argument of violence increased during this particular year, and violent video game sales also increased, meaning violent video games are promoting violence and causing people.
So we find that carelessly, the argument that the show accidentally endorses imperialism accidentally relies on the potential accident of coincidence. The point is left vulnerable. In line with this, the fascist case, which shares the Shinzo Abe point, relies likewise in conjecture.
The audience is on the side of the military taking complete control of everything. If a fascist were going to dramatize the exact conditions necessitating their own seizure of power, this would be it, right? Like, the government is ineffectual, you have to trust us, you have to trust the military. And it's kind of weird that the story never contemplates transferring power to some kind of democratically elected body. Like, I understand that this is a medieval-esque society, but the writer is the one who decides that. And their choice to make it that way says something about their intent and the work. Aaron's entire character is that he believes in freedom, but he doesn't have anything to say about a military regime remaining in power indefinitely. They couldn't even maybe hint a little bit that we're going to move past dictatorship-style governments at some point? Like, just a little? So it's within all of...
But the counters here are endless. As literal Maverick put it, it cannot be said that because there are fascist stories similar to the events in Attack on Titan, the narrative becomes fascist. It seems the point could have been better put across and defended, were it not an oversimplification of occurrences in the series. Just a critic handles this superbly.
If this series has not condemned the action, violence, its entire roster of characters' decisions, then I truly will never find anything that does or has. Enough of that, otherwise, as I said, I could be here all day showing examples. Another point Just Right makes is about military propaganda. He mentions the show has military solutions to solve its problems and that the soldiers themselves are the only competent people. He goes a step further and even insists the show presents the military, in particular the coup d'etat, as unambiguously good. I disagree with this so strongly that I was waiting for him to say psych. For one, there are other people outside the military occupation that are competent, such as Rod Rice and Tiber. Sure, there's a lack of them, but that's because Attack on Titan is constructed to focus upon its military, which exposes all of the problems that come with a military-led civilization. Actually, to prove that, back towards the coup d'etat, which, remember, he says is portrayed as unambiguously good. The coup by the military isn't supposed to be seen as a positive thing. In Season 4, Hanji hides the truth about Eren from the Eldians inside the walls, and she remembers that the men she tortured told her that she will be the new actor deceiving the people.
The final wall of the argument holds firmly initially. If the plight of the Eldians we are to take as an allegory for Jews in the Third Reich, then indeed the matter of Ili Tiber, an Eldian controlling Mali behind the scenes, is read.
Allegory to not. The story invites us to look at all of the other implications of this allegory. We have to ask, when and where exactly does this allegory end? Which situations does the show depict Eldians in where we're supposed to interpret it as allegorical, and which of them are we supposed to infer aren't allegorical? That line is not clear at all. For instance, the entire Marleyan regime uses the fact that the Eldians once ruled the world as the primary reason for why they should be feared, hated, segregated, and controlled. The story does cast some doubt on how true the Marleyan version of events is to a degree. So in Season 3, Aaron's father Grisha becomes part of a secret underground resistance within Marley to reinstate the Eldian monarchy. While studying history books on the subject, Grisha concludes that their ancestor, Ymir, wasn't a violent warmonger, but that she used the Titans for productive purposes. That could be true of Ymir herself, but the basic premise of the story doesn't work at all unless at some point the Eldians really did build an empire and really did conquer the world through violence. I mean, renouncing violence is the reason the Eldian king Fritz retreats to the island and builds the wall in the first place. And we know that he did do those things because the walls exist. If there wasn't a history of bloody conquest perpetrated by the Eldians, the whole story wouldn't have happened. In a recent episode, we learned that another part of the Marleyans' official version of history is untrue. For 100 years, they were told that King Fritz had retreated to the island out of fear, and that there was a Marleyan hero who had defeated him, both of which are revealed to be false. But this doesn't really change things. We have this weird situation where the Marleyans are definitely spreading a partially fabricated story, but it's also not false enough to undermine the basic quote-unquote logic of their racism. The fact that there was this empire is the entire stated justification for why Marleyans hate Eldians. The story treats this like a mathematical equation. The Eldians hurt them in the past, therefore they hate them now. It presents racism as this completely logical, rational conclusion. And what this misses about the persecution of the Jewish people under Nazi Germany is that anti-Semitism is fundamentally irrational. There is no justification for why vast swaths of the population in Europe decided to hate Jews rather than any other group of people.
Unfortunately, the key phrase here is if we are to take. This interpretation, though the one I defaulted to on initially watching the show, is not the only valid one.
I agree that the allegory to Jews falls apart in specific ways, such as if we use it on a character such as Tiber. But I also think that it's clear that the show is saying that, regardless of the logic, racism and bigotry is an inherent evil that further amplifies the horror that humanity is capable of. Like I said before, I believe that Attack on Titan is fundamentally against the argument of the greater good, which, by the way, is a fascist argument. So the argument that Marley uses against the Eldians, that because they can turn into Titans that they are devils and must be eradicated for the greater good, is still an unacceptable one. The argument is not what should matter when it comes to issues of racism. It's the rule that racism is bad, that othering people for things that they can't control is wrong. Full stop. I agree that if you're using this argument with the Eldians, you can make the argument that Just Right is making. You can say, look, they just made an allegory that the Eldians...
Now this matter is very touchy, and it's incredibly important I handle it appropriately. Just Right spends a portion of the video diving into the Eldians of Attack on Titan, a group he says essentially resembled the Jewish that suffered persecution by Nazi Germany. Therefore, he logically says you can feel sympathetic for them, as they're suffering unjustly under authoritarian government. He's somewhat right and mentions the Eldians and Marleyans too have justifiable means to hate each other from their own views, Eldians though being far more justified. However, since he believes the Eldians are one-to-one creations of the Jewish who suffered barbaric treatment, he then concludes that by adding this sort of rationale to the Marleyans' view of the Eldians, that Isayama is saying there was some sort of rationale for the way the Jewish were treated. This is so wrong, and it's incredibly dangerous to think this way, to even suggest it. The Eldians are not one-to-one allegorical representations of the Jewish during World War II. Certainly they are inspired by them, but they're different. In this fictitious world, Isayama has made it that the Eldians have done wrong and must have for the Marleyans to act in the way they have. Gruger, after all, says none of their histories even...
The point further weakened when embedded into the matter of the large hooked noses. I never noticed this as a commonality and do not believe this to be the case. However, his statement on reading the fortune board is being grossly misunderstood. Looking at the point in isolation, it is clear to see why.
Video where we acknowledge that the race of monsters that are often depicted with large hooked noses are exclusively members of the race which we're allegorically connecting to Jews during the Holocaust. Whenever I've seen that point brought up, I see pushback that it's an alarmist, overly sensitive point to make. That the Titans are caricaturized in a bunch of different ways. It's not just the noses. But look, I won't post the comments here, but I did, do research for this video. I read the Chan boards. I know how these images are interpreted by white supremacists. I can't say for certain that Isayama intended to send this message, but I do know what message is being received.
Things do get worse, as he says something I would have never expected. That white supremacists see these monsters, of which can only be aliens in the story, as Jewish people or resembling the features associated with the Jewish. Are we seriously doing that? Are we seriously going to use that as evidence of racism in the story, using other people's interpretations, especially people who have illogical views? We can't rationalize prompt serious discussion and criticism because people are interpreting media one way. As I said earlier, everyone can interpret literally anything, as they do right now, with a political lens that can be offensive. This doesn't mean the show was sloppy, careless, or didn't do enough to quash these sentiments. We as humans cannot funnel or change everyone's mindset. It's bound to happen that you have people who have alternative views entirely, especially if the show is political at its core. It just doesn't matter.
Quickly, I agree that the allegory to Jews falls apart in specific ways, such as if we use it on a character such as Tiber. But I also think that it's clear that the show is saying that, regardless of the logic, racism and bigotry is an inherent evil that further amplifies the horror that humanity is capable of. Like I said before, I believe that Attack on Titan is fundamentally against the argument of the greater good, which, by the way, is a fascist argument. So the argument that Marley uses.
Both counters accurately acknowledge the absence of a significant enough number of hooked-nosed titans, but I feel misunderstand the reference to fortune, given that the argument around which this video is constructed is that Attack on Titan accidentally endorses anti-Semitism. When he says he read the boards, he's not making the claim that because terrible is some of where people interpret well meaning into the work, it must be evidence that it is anti-Semitic. It is a statement to prove that the show accidentally endorses this anti-Semitism. Of course, the point could have been stronger if handled with more care, but as Literal Maverick put it, visiting only one biased community, the 1%, is not enough. To the creators of these 3 highly entertaining videos, I would like to express my thanks. Their links are in the description if available. All of you have done well to watch my video on pick. In the end, Just Right's argument does not hold up. It could have been a stronger piece and withstood the barrage unleashed on it if it was better geared rightly with a cat's panzer in it. In the end, I surely hope I was not careless in the creation of this video and hope it is understood. I pray one day we will find the ending of Attack on Titan will justify its means to those who doubt its goodwill.